She was never supposed to be the one standing at that door. She was the backup, the second choice, the name written in pencil when the first one was crossed out in ink. And if you have ever felt like someone's second option, like you were chosen only because someone better wasn't available, then this story was written for you. Stay with me, because what happens next will remind you that sometimes the life you were never meant to have turns out to be the only one that ever truly felt like yours. And if you love quiet, emotional Western stories about healing, belonging, and love that grows slowly like a fire finding warmth in the cold, make sure you subscribe before this video ends. There are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Now let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Clara Weston. She was 31 years old, soft-spoken, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep had ever fully erased. She had a small daughter named Lily, who was 6 years old and carried a worn cloth rabbit everywhere she went. Clara had been raising Lily alone for 3 years, ever since her husband Thomas left without a note, without a goodbye, without anything except an empty side of the bed and a silence so loud it rang in her ears for months. Clara worked at a laundry in St. Louis. She scrubbed other people's linens until her hands cracked and bled. She fed Lily with whatever was left after rent. She told herself every night that she was fine, that they were fine, that she did not need anything more than what she had. But sometimes, late at night, when Lily was asleep and the candle burned low, Clara would press her hands flat on the table and stare at the wood grain and feel something she could not name. Not grief exactly, not anger, something quieter and heavier, like being invisible in a room full of people. She had answered the advertisement on a Wednesday. She had not planned to. She had seen it pinned to the post office board, half covered by another notice, and she had walked past it twice before she stopped. Wanted. A woman of steady character and kind disposition to serve as wife to a widowed rancher in Millhaven, Texas. Must be willing to relocate. Children welcome. She had read it 4 times. Then she had taken it down, folded it into her coat pocket, and carried it home without letting herself think too much about it. She wrote back that evening. What she did not know, what she would not find out until weeks later, was that the advertisement had not been meant for her. There had been another woman first. A woman named Helen Marsh, 24 years old, pretty in the way people described as obvious, who had answered the rancher's letter first, who had exchanged correspondence with him for 2 months, who had been the one he was expecting when he arranged for someone to be picked up at the station in Millhaven. But Helen had changed her mind 3 days before she was supposed to leave. She had met someone else, someone closer, someone she did not have to cross state lines to find. She had sent a letter, but the letter arrived late. And by then, Clara was already on the train. The rancher's name was Eli Calloway. He was 38. Tall in a way that was less about height and more about stillness, the kind of man who took up space without trying, who walked slowly and said very little, and made you feel, when he did speak, that every word had been chosen carefully. He had broad shoulders that carried more than years of ranch work. He had lost his wife, May, 2 winters ago. A fever that came fast and left nothing behind except a 6-year-old boy named Samuel and a silence in the house that felt like a third person living there. Eli had not wanted to remarry. It had been his neighbor, Ruth, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had no patience for watching a good man sink into himself, who had suggested the advertisement. It had taken her 3 weeks of persistent, pointed conversation to convince him. He had finally agreed, not because he wanted a wife, but because Samuel had stopped speaking much, and the house had stopped feeling like anything at all, and Eli had run out of ways to pretend that was acceptable. He had expected Helen. He was standing at the edge of the station platform, hat in hand, when the train arrived. He watched the passengers step down one by one, scanning for the description Helen had given in her last letter, fair-haired, young, traveling alone. What he saw instead was a woman with dark hair pinned back under a tired hat, a little girl balanced on her hip, a carpet bag in her other hand, and eyes that were scanning the platform with the careful look of someone trying not to appear as uncertain as they felt. Clara saw the sign he was holding, her name written in careful block letters, C. Weston. She walked toward him slowly. He looked at her, then at Lily, then back at her. She lifted her chin a fraction and said, "I'm Clara Weston. I'm sorry if I'm not what you were expecting." There was a long pause. He put his hat back on his head and said, "There's a wagon out front. It's a long ride to the ranch." That was all. No welcome, no warmth, no cruelty either. Just a fact, delivered quietly, and then he turned and walked toward the wagon, and Clara followed because she had nowhere else to go. The ride to the Callaway Ranch took nearly 2 hours along a road that wound through flat, golden land, under a sky so wide it made Clara feel both very small and somehow less trapped than she had in years. Lily fell asleep against her arm before the first hour was out. Eli drove without speaking. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and watched the land and tried to understand what she had walked into. When they arrived, the house was plain and clean, a 2-story wooden structure that had clearly been built by someone who cared more about soundness than beauty. A vegetable garden along one side, a barn beyond it, a porch with 2 chairs that looked like they had not been used in a long time. Samuel was waiting on the porch. He was small for 6, with his father's dark eyes and a way of standing very still that reminded Clara immediately of Eli. He watched them pull up to the house without moving, without waving, just watching. Clara stepped down from the wagon and looked at him and smiled. He did not smile back, but he did not look away either. That night, after supper, which was a quiet, careful meal of bread and beans and very little conversation, Eli sat across the table from Clara and explained the situation in plain terms. He said he had been expecting someone else. He said the arrangement had been made in good faith, but that he understood if she wanted to return to St. Louis. He said he would pay her fare back if she chose to leave. Clara looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. She said, "I don't have anything to go back to, but I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not. I'm not going to be a ghost in this house or a replacement for whoever came before me. If I stay as myself." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's fair." It was not a warm agreement. It was not a promise. But it was honest, and Clara had been lied to enough times that honesty, even cold and plain, felt like something she could hold on to. They married the following week at the county office in town. No flowers, no celebration. The judge read the words, they signed the paper, and then Eli paid for a small lunch at the diner down the road, and they drove back to the ranch in the same careful silence they had established from the beginning. Clara did not let herself feel sad about it. She had not come here for romance. She had come here for solid ground, for Lily, for a chance to stop drowning slowly in a city that did not care whether she sank. She set about building a life inside that careful silence. She was not passive about it. That was the thing people who did not know Clara often misunderstood. Her quietness looked like softness from the outside, but underneath it was a steady, determined spine. She had learned to be self-sufficient out of necessity, not preference, and she applied that same energy to the ranch. She reorganized the kitchen within the first week. Not because anything was wrong with how it had been, but because she needed to understand the space, to make it hers in some small way. She planted more herbs along the garden edge. She found a basket of May's old sewing things in the back of a cupboard and spent a long evening holding it, considering, and then set it gently in a box on the top shelf instead of putting it away or throwing it out. She was not trying to erase May. She understood what it was to have lost someone who had once been the center of a life. She was just trying to find where she fit in the shape of things that already existed. Samuel watched her constantly. He would appear in doorways and hover at the edges of rooms, observing. He still barely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, careful sentences. But he followed Lily sometimes when she played in the yard, at a distance first, then closer. Lily, who was entirely unaware of complicated adult emotions and simply accepted the world as it came to her, treated Samuel like he had always been there. She offered him her rabbit once, which was the most serious gift she possessed, and Samuel had held it carefully with both hands and then handed it back with something approaching solemnity. Clara saw this from the kitchen window and pressed her hand flat against the glass. With Eli, it was harder. He was not unkind. He was not cold in the way some men were cold, with sharp edges and dismissal. He was more like a room with all the windows shut. Warm enough inside you could sense it, but closed against the outside in a way that told you the warmth was not meant for you. He worked from before sunrise to after dark. He thanked her for meals. He answered questions. He never once raised his voice or said anything that cut. But he also never sat beside her on the porch in the evenings. He never asked her about her life before. He never looked at her in a way that made her feel seen. Clara told herself she did not need to be seen. She had the ground beneath her feet and a roof, and Lily was sleeping soundly, and that was enough. She told herself that for about 6 weeks. Then the fever came. It started with Lily, as illness often did with children, fast and frightening, a high temperature and a shallow cough that kept Clara awake through 2 nights in a row, holding her daughter and counting breaths, and fighting down the particular terror that lives in the chest of every mother who has ever sat alone with a sick child. On the second night, she heard footsteps in the hall. Eli appeared in the doorway. He had been awake too, she realized. He had heard. He looked at Lily, who was pale and damp-haired against the pillow, and then he looked at Clara, who was sitting beside the bed with her arms wrapped around herself in a posture she did not know she had adopted. He said, "I'll ride for the doctor." She said, "It's the middle of the night." He said, "That doesn't matter," and he was already pulling his boots on. He was back with the doctor before dawn. The doctor confirmed it was a chest cold, serious but manageable, prescribed a medicine and told Clara to keep Lily warm and rested for a week. Clara sat in the kitchen after he left, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she was so tired and so relieved that she could not quite find the right expression for her face. Eli sat down across from her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to be all right." Clara nodded. He said, "You didn't have to stay up alone. You could have come and gotten me." She looked up at him. She said, "I didn't know if that was allowed." Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just slightly, the way a door shifts when the wind changes direction outside. He said, "You're my wife, Clara." He said it plainly, not romantically, not as a declaration, just as a fact he was reminding her of, as though she had perhaps forgotten. But something in the way he said her name stayed with her for a long time after. Lily recovered slowly over the following week, and during that week something began to change in the house, so gradually that Clara almost did not notice it at first. Eli started coming in for supper earlier. He started asking Samuel to help set the table, which meant Samuel was in the kitchen at the same time as Clara, which led to Samuel eventually asking her in his careful way what she was making, and then asking if he could stir things, and then simply appearing beside her at the counter as a matter of course, as though he had always done it. One evening, Eli came in and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his son standing beside Clara, pressing shapes into biscuit dough, and Clara showing Lily how to do the same, and all 4 of them talking in the easy, overlapping way of people who are becoming used to each other. He stood there long enough that Clara noticed. When she looked up, he looked down quickly at his boots. She did not say anything, but she felt it. That small, fragile thing beginning to exist between them. Then the letter arrived. It came on a Thursday, addressed to Eli, from a man named Gordon Calloway, Eli's older brother who had moved east years ago and with whom, Clara had understood from various small mentions, the relationship was not warm. She did not read the letter. She set it on Eli's desk, but she heard the conversation that followed that evening, not by intention, but because the walls of a ranch house are not thick, and she was in the hallway when Eli came to find her. He told her directly, which she appreciated. He said Gordon had written to remind him that under the terms of their father's will, the ranch was to pass to the eldest son if Eli died without a proper heir, meaning a blood child. He said Gordon had gotten word somehow, through the loose thread of small-town gossip that stretched across great distances, that Eli had remarried. And Gordon had written to suggest, politely but with an edge underneath the politeness, that the marriage might not be entirely legitimate given the circumstances of how it had come about. Clara stood very still while he told her this. Then she said, "What does he want?" Eli said, "He wants to make sure Samuel won't inherit. He's always wanted this land. He just never had a reason to push for it before." Clara felt something settle into place in her chest. Not fear exactly, something more like clarity. She said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I don't want you to feel like you have to fight a battle that isn't yours." She said, "Eli, look at me." He did. She said, "I chose to come here. I chose to stay. I chose to marry you and I chose to make a home here. This is mine now too. Samuel is mine now too, Or at least I'd like him to be if he'll have me. So don't stand there and tell me this battle isn't mine." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. He said, quietly, "All right." Gordon arrived 2 weeks later. He was nothing like Eli. He was polished in a way that felt deliberately designed to make other people feel the lack of polish in themselves. He smiled too smoothly and shook hands too firmly, and looked at Clara with the specific expression of someone calculating exactly how much of a problem she was going to be. Clara offered him coffee and biscuits and was entirely pleasant, and said almost nothing that gave him any useful information. Afterward, when they were alone, Eli looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. He said, "You were very careful." She said, "I've dealt with men like that before. They're looking for a crack to fit a lever into. You don't give them a crack." He watched her for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn that?" She said, "From being underestimated my whole life." Gordon's attempt came through a lawyer in town, a formal challenge to the validity of the marriage based on the claim that it had been entered into under false pretenses, specifically that Eli had advertised for one woman and accepted another. Clara handled it by sitting down with Ruth, the neighbor who had helped arrange the original advertisement, and together they compiled every letter, every record, every receipt. Clara was methodical and thorough and quietly relentless, and the lawyer, when faced with the full and organized documentation of a legitimate marriage entered into by two consenting adults, found that Gordon's argument had significantly less substance than it had appeared to have. Gordon left on a Friday morning. He did not say goodbye. That evening, Eli found Clara on the porch. He sat down in the other chair, the one that had not been used in a long time. They sat for a while without speaking, watching the sun go down over the flat, golden land. Then Eli said, "I owe you something." She said, "You don't owe me anything." He said, "I do. I've been treating you like you were temporary, like you were something I was enduring until things went back to normal. But nothing is going back to normal. And you're not temporary. You never were." Clara did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the horizon. She said, "I know what it is to grieve someone. I know it takes time." He said, "It's not just grief. It's that I convinced myself I didn't deserve to be happy again, that wanting something for myself was a betrayal of what I'd lost." She turned to look at him then. He was looking at her, really looking, the way she had been waiting without admitting it for months. He said, "You are not a replacement, Clara. You never were. You're something entirely different. You're the person who walked into a house that had given up and made it into a home again. And I don't know how to say that properly, but I needed you to know it." Clara felt something in her chest, something she had been holding closed for a very long time, begin very slowly to open. She said, "I came here refusing to live someone else's life. I meant that. I wasn't going to be May, and I wasn't going to be Helen, whoever she was, and I wasn't going to be the sad version of myself from St. Louis. I was just going to be me. And I didn't know if that would ever be enough for this place." He said, "It's more than enough." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Samuel asked me last week if he could call me something other than Clara." Eli went very still. She said, "I told him he could call me whatever felt right to him. And he thought about it for a while, and then he said he wanted to call me Mama. And I told him that would make me very happy." Eli looked away. She could see him working through something, his jaw tight, his hands still. Then he said quietly, "Thank you." She reached over and put her hand on top of his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed that way until the stars came out, the two children asleep inside, the land quiet and enormous around them, and something between them that was not pretend, and not a replacement, and not a transaction, but simply, finally, real. The wedding they had in the spring was not for legal reasons. They were already married on paper. This was for everything that the paper had not covered. Ruth organized it. She was deeply satisfied about the whole situation and made no secret of it. It was held in the yard behind the house, on a warm April morning, with the vegetable garden blooming along the fence, and a table of food that the neighboring families had contributed, and a sky that was the specific blue that only exists in Texas in spring. Samuel stood beside Eli in a clean shirt. Lily stood beside Clara in a dress with yellow ribbons that Clara had sewn herself. The minister read the words, and Clara and Eli said them back, slowly, looking at each other, meaning every syllable. And when it was done, Samuel reached up and took Clara's hand, and Lily took Eli's. And the four of them stood there in the April light, not a replacement family, not a second choice, not a backup plan, just a family, exactly as they were supposed to be. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that being someone's second option doesn't mean you can't end up exactly where you belong, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what part stayed with you. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. There are people watching this from places I've never even imagined, and that means everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. There are more stories like this one, slow, warm, true in the way that matters, and I don't want you to miss a single one.